So, you might have caught wind of some potentially significant shifts happening in India's approach to nuclear energy. Today, on the deep dives, we're going to try and, dissect what's actually going on.
Yeah, it's quite a development.
We'll be exploring the Indian government's plans to reshape the regulations, the laws governing its atomic energy sector.
Yeah.
And there's also this recent and pretty interesting regulatory decision from the U.S. side, too.
Exactly. Our exploration today, it's drawing from reporting in the Indian Express. They've detailed the proposed changes to, well, two key acts, the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act and the Fundamental Atomic Energy Act.
Okay.
And we'll also look at the implications of the U.S. giving the green light for transferring small modular reactor technology, SMRs.
Right, SMRs. So our aim here is to make sense of these shifts for you, provide a clear understanding of what they mean, their significance, especially if you're tracking India's economy, its energy policy choices, or, its international partnerships.
Which is definitely key for UPSC aspirants keeping up with these major current events.
Absolutely. So the Indian government seems set on some, well, notable legislative reforms. Where should we kick things off?
Okay, well, the first big area is the proposed changes to the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act. That's the 2010 Act.
Right.
And what's interesting to think about here is the current, let's say, hurdle. As the law stands now, the responsibility, the liability for damages, if there's an incident, it gets channeled towards the company supplying the equipment.
Okay. And that's understandably made some of the major global players a bit wary, hasn't it?
Okay.
You're talking about the big names like GE, Hitachi, Westinghouse.
Framatome, yeah,
Right.
That's precisely the issue. These are, huge multinational corporations. And the idea of potentially unlimited liability hanging over them, that's been a pretty significant deterrent to them investing properly in India's nuclear power sector.
You can see why.
So the proposed amendments are really designed specifically to tackle that hesitation.
Okay, so what are the actual changes they're floating? How are they trying to sort of reassure these international investors?
Well, the main ideas involve two key tweaks. First, there's a move to cap the financial liability of these equipment vendors, cap it at the original value of their contract.
Okay, so a defined limit.
Exactly. It offers a much more predictable, manageable level of financial risk.
Yeah.
And second, they're proposing to introduce a time limit on this liability.
A time limit.
Yeah, so after a set period, the vendors just wouldn't be liable anymore for potential damages down the line. Before, these companies were potentially on the hook for everything, regardless of their contract size.
Wow, okay.
That created, well, unacceptable uncertainty for them, especially when you compare it to liability laws elsewhere, like, say, Canada, where the operator takes on more responsibility after a while.
That definitely sounds like a major shift, creating a much more predictable environment for businesses making these huge long-term investments. Now, you mentioned two areas of reform. The second one concerns the older Atomic Energy Act of 1962. What's the current situation there?
Right now, operating nuclear power plants in India is pretty much the domain of state-owned entities. Primarily NPCIL, that's the Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited, and NTPC. That's been the model.
The established way of doing things. And what's the proposed change here?
Well, the amendment looks to broaden who can participate. It aims to allow private Indian companies, and maybe even foreign firms, to actually operate nuclear power plants to generate electricity.
Interesting. That would be quite a departure from decades of state control.
It really would.
So what's the thinking behind that? What are the expected benefits of bringing the private sector into the mix?
The upsides they're hoping for are pretty significant. You could see public-private partnerships forming, which might bring in, much-needed capital and maybe speed up project timelines.
Makes sense.
It also opens the door for foreign companies to hold minority stakes, minority equity in these projects, attracting more investment that way, too. And beyond just the money, more competition could lead to greater efficiency, maybe faster adoption of new technologies. It's not just about capital. Private players often bring specific know-how and project management and efficiency, like we've seen in other infrastructure areas in India.
So technology infusion and investment are really central goals here.
Exactly.
Okay, so those are the potential legislative changes. But then there's this other piece you mentioned, the U.S. regulatory development. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yes, this is a really crucial part of this whole picture. Back in March 2025, the U.S. Department of Energy, the DOE, granted a significant regulatory clearance.
Okay.
It was given to a company called Holtec International. and it specifically relates to their small modular reactor technology, the SMRs we mentioned.
And Holtec is working with Indian partners on this, I believe. Tata Consulting Engineers and L&T.
That's right, Larsen and Toubro, exactly. The approval came under something called Part 810 of the U.S. Atomic Energy Act.
Part 810.
Now, what's really significant here is that this part of the act, or at least how it was interpreted before, had effectively stopped U.S. companies from doing nuclear design and manufacturing work in India.
Okay.
Part 810 basically controls the export and transfer of U.S. nuclear tech and information. The previous interpretation was a major roadblock for actually designing and building things collaboratively inside India. So this clearance, it signals a real shift.
So this wasn't just ticking a box. It's a change in the U.S. perspective on nuclear collaboration with India.
I think so, yes. This clearance now lets Holtec and its Indian partners move ahead with co-production, actually making these SMRs and transferring the technology within India itself.
Right.
And that fits perfectly with India's long-term aims, like boosting domestic manufacturing, making India, and reducing reliance on energy imports. It really does show a change in the U.S. regulatory stance, aligning it more closely with India's strategic and commercial interests.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. How do these two things, the legislative reforms in India and this U.S. clearance, how do they connect to the bigger picture? What are the wider implications?
Well, if you step back and look at the broader context, these developments seem clearly linked to the ongoing efforts to improve trade and investment between India and the U.S.
The potential trade pact discussions.
Exactly. It could potentially give more momentum to those talks. Nuclear cooperation, you see, really strengthens the bilateral relationship in important ways.
How so, specifically?
Well, first, it broadens the scope of clean energy collaboration. That's crucial given climate change goals globally. Second, it deepens the strategic trust between India and the U.S. Cooperating on sensitive tech like this signals a higher level of partnership.
Okay.
And looking even further ahead, this could potentially position India as an export hub for nuclear tech down the line, especially for these SMRs.
That's quite an ambition. What about closer to home? India's own energy needs, its climate targets? How do these changes fit in there?
Oh, hugely significant implications there for India's energy security and definitely for its commitment to hit net zero emissions by 2070.
Right.
See, right now, the growth in India's nuclear power capacity is, well, it's lagging behind other clean energy sources like solar and wind. Opening up the sector could really help accelerate that expansion.
So diversifying the energy mix is a major part of this.
Absolutely. It allows for much greater diversification of the clean energy portfolio, reduces reliance on coal, obviously, but also on imported fossil fuels like oil and gas. Plus, these international tech partnerships and the push for domestic manufacturing, that's bound to spur innovation within India's own energy sector.
We can't ignore the sheer scale of India's growing energy appetite.
That's a critical point. Projections suggest India's electricity demand could double by 2040, maybe even sooner.
Double. Wow.
Yeah. And nuclear energy, with its ability to provide consistent, reliable baseload power, that's the power that's always on, unlike intermittent solar or wind, and do it with a minimal carbon footprint, it's really poised to play a vital role in meeting that massive demand sustainably.
Absolutely critical for baseload.
Yeah.
Okay, but of course, any big policy shift like this isn't without its difficulties. What are some of the main challenges we should be aware of?
You're right to ask. It's not all smooth sailing. Several challenges remain. There's likely to be continued political debate, public discussion around safety concerns with nuclear power. That's always present.
Understandably.
And amending the nuclear liability law specifically, that's proven to be a complex, potentially drawn-out legislative fight in the past.
Yeah.
Could be again.
Right, that could be tough.
Definitely. And then, as private companies get involved, ensuring really strict regulatory oversight, maintaining the absolute highest safety standards, that's going to be paramount. It's a tricky balance, isn't it? Attracting investment, fostering innovation, but never compromising on safety and public trust.
A very delicate balance indeed. But looking forward, let's say these reforms manage to navigate these hurdles. What's the potential long-term prize here?
Well, if they are successful, these reforms could genuinely position India as a major hub for next-generation nuclear technologies. SMRs, maybe other advanced reactor designs too.
A hub.
And that would significantly boost India's energy independence and its overall technological self-reliance in what is undoubtedly a critical sector for the future.
So summing up then, it really seems like the Indian government's planned legislative changes, coupled with this U.S. regulatory green light, represent a Well, a potentially transformative moment for India's nuclear energy program.
I think that's fair to say.
And it has significant implications, particularly for those of you keeping track for UPSC exams following India's evolving energy and foreign policy landscape.
Precisely. It's a major policy shift, one that could revitalize the whole sector and integrate India much more deeply into global clean energy supply chains. But, as always, the real impact hinges on getting these laws passed, making sure the regulatory framework is truly ready, and achieving a consensus among all the different stakeholders involved.
Always the key. And on that note, thinking about India's rocketing energy needs and its climate commitments, it really does make you wonder, doesn't it? How might bringing in more private and foreign players truly reshape the country's energy landscape over the next few decades? It's definitely something to ponder those long-term strategic implications. A really important question for you to consider as you think about India's energy future.
Absolutely. And look, if you found this deep dive into India's nuclear sector reforms useful, informative, relevant to your understanding, whether for UPSC prep or just general interest, please do give us a like, subscribe, and definitely leave a comment below. Let us know if you have more questions or thoughts on this crucial topic. And just to remind you, all the information we discussed today was based on reporting from the Indian Express. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.